5 years from now, when textbooks finally catch up to what satellites are already seeing, you'll remember that the picture changed here. Quietly, without fanfare, somewhere between a radar pulse bouncing off a Mindanao floodplain and a researcher squinting at a screen in a cluttered office. That moment is happening right now. To be honest, what NASA's SRTM and ALOS PAUSAR radar systems have been mapping across the Philippine archipelago isn't just terrain, it's the skeleton of something enormous. A civilization built not on stone monuments or military conquest, but on water, on the patient, deliberate engineering of rivers, lakes, and tidal channels stretching across thousands of kilometers of island chain and connecting them deliberately to the rest of maritime Asia. We call it, loosely, a water empire, but that phrase barely scratches the surface. The satellite data shows networks of ancient waterways, some natural, some clearly modified by human hands, linking communities across Mindanao, the Visayas and Luzon in patterns that are too regular to be accidental. The channel widths are consistent, while the branching angles repeat. Someone planned this, someone with authority, resources, and a remarkably long time horizon. And here's the part that bureaucracy almost buried permanently. But there's a detail. The research almost didn't happen, not because of secrecy or suppression, nothing so dramatic. It almost didn't happen because of a filing error, a genuinely, almost comically mundane filing error. Back in 2019, a team of Filipino archaeologists and remote sensing specialists submitted a formal request to cross-reference NASA's shuttle radar topography mission data with existing archaeological site maps from the National Museum of the Philippines. Standard academic procedure: fill out the forms, get the approvals, begin the analysis. On the other hand, the request sat in an administrative queue for 14 months. 14 months. Not because anyone objected, not because the research was sensitive, but because the interdepartmental memo routing the request was addressed to a division that had been reorganized 18 months earlier. The memo kept bouncing between offices like a lost tourist asking for directions in a city where all the street signs had recently been replaced. By the time someone with enough seniority actually looked at the problem, one of the lead researchers had already left for a position at a university in Singapore. The project had to be partially rebuilt. This is how we lose history, not through fire or conquest, through paperwork. But here's what that delay couldn't stop, and this is the part worth sitting with. The data itself was waiting, patient as sediment. The radar pulses had already bounced off the Earth and come back. The topographic information was already encoded. And when the analysis finally moved forward, what emerged was staggering enough that several researchers initially assumed they'd made an error in their GIS modeling software. They hadn't. Think about what radar imaging actually does. It strips away vegetation. It ignores the canopy, the centuries of forest growth, the undergrowth that has swallowed ruins whole. It sees the ground, and what the ground remembers in subtle changes of elevation, in the faint depressions of old channels, in the geometric regularity of earthworks, the radar reports faithfully. There's a useful comparison here. When archaeologists used similar LiDAR technology over the Guatemalan jungle in 2018, they found that the known Maya settlement was roughly 30 times larger than previously mapped. 30 times. The jungle had hidden it completely from ground-level survey. The principle is the same in the Philippines, just with different geography and different water. The Philippines isn't jungle all the way down. It's river systems, it's lake basins, it's tidal estuaries, and the modifications to those systems, now visible in the radar data, suggest something systematic happening across centuries. Stop for a moment. We're not talking about a single polity with a capital city and a throne room. That's the European mental model, and it doesn't translate well here. What the data suggests is a networked civilization, distributed nodes of population connected by managed waterways, operating through trade relationships and shared hydraulic infrastructure rather than centralized military control. Scholars studying maritime Southeast Asia have used the term mandala states for this kind of structure. power radiating outward from a center, overlapping with other centers, constantly negotiating rather than conquering. The Philippines fits that model, and the satellite data is now giving that model a physical skeleton it never had before. The Laguna copperplate inscription, 900 CE, the oldest written document found in the Philippines, already told us that this archipelago was trading with Java, with the Malay world, with cultures that had sophisticated administrative systems. The inscription mentions debt settlements and high social titles. It mentions place names that correspond to real locations. This wasn't a collection of isolated villages. This was a society with records. What the satellite data adds is the infrastructure story, precisely story, the how. Because maintaining trade networks across thousands of island kilometers requires more than boats and ambition. It requires reliable stopping points, safe anchorages, fresh water sources, routes that can be navigated predictably, seasonally, year after year. Someone had to build and maintain those routes. Someone had to know where the channels silted up in dry season and where they flooded in wet season. That knowledge doesn't exist by accident. It lives in communities. It gets passed down. It requires an administrative structure, not necessarily a palace bureaucracy, but something. Local authorities with specific responsibilities, agreements between communities about who maintains which stretch of waterway, trade laws, conflict resolution. We have almost none of this in the written record. Because most of it was never written down, or because what was written didn't survive, or because, and this is the uncomfortable part, a significant portion of the early colonial administration actively discouraged the preservation of pre-colonial records, not out of calculated malice in most cases, out of religious zeal, administrative confusion, and the particular kind of confident ignorance that comes from believing your own civilization is the only one that counts. That's not a conspiracy. That's a pattern repeated across every colonial encounter in history. Bureaucratic arrogance dressed up as civilization. The archaeologists who eventually got the interdepartmental memo situation sorted out and got their cross-reference data set found something specific in the Mindanao River Basin analysis. There are earthwork signatures near the upper reaches of several major river systems that don't correspond to any known settlement site. They're upstream from the population centers. They're positioned topographically in ways that would allow water diversion, irrigation possibly, or flood control, or both. One researcher described it in an interview as looking like the logic of the system running backward from what they expected. They'd assumed the waterways connected settlements. To be honest, what the data suggests is that the settlements grew up around the waterways. The infrastructure came first. The communities organized themselves around it. That flips the standard narrative, because if the hydraulic infrastructure preceded the population growth, then someone was planning at a scale that assumes a long future. You don't build a water management system for a community that doesn't exist yet unless you're thinking in generations, not years. There's a parallel to the ancient irrigation systems of Sri Lanka. The tank cascade systems, chains of reservoirs linked by channels designed to manage rainfall across entire watersheds, were built and maintained across centuries, surviving political upheavals and regime changes because the local communities understood they depended on the infrastructure for survival. The system outlasted the states that built it. The Philippine evidence is starting to look similar in its logic. A water infrastructure so embedded in the landscape and in community life that it persisted even as political authority shifted, as trade partners changed, as rulers rose and fell, and all of it invisible to ground survey, hidden under 500 years of forest growth and sedimentation, until the radar poles traveling at the speed of light bounced off a hillside in Mindanao and came back with news. On the other hand, the bureaucratic tangle that delayed this research by 14 months is not ancient history. It's a problem that still exists. Funding structures that don't talk to each other, academic departments that guard their data, government agencies that process requests on geological timescales, international collaborations that get snagged on IP agreements and data sharing protocols, written by lawyers who've never heard of the Laguna copperplate. Incidentally, the irony is almost poetic. An ancient civilization that mastered the art of connection, of linking communities across water, of building infrastructure that enabled exchange, being studied by modern institutions that can barely manage an interdepartmental email. But the researchers pushed through it. They rebuilt the team. They renegotiated the data agreements. One of them drove 4 hours to hand-deliver a signed authorization form because the institutional fax machine was broken and the digital submission portal was down for maintenance. Now pay attention. The fax machine was broken. These are the battles of modern archaeology. Not against jungles or dangerous excavations, against expired software licenses and printers that run out of toner on deadline day. And what came out of all that frustration? A map. A growing, continuously refined map of a civilization that connected this archipelago to the wider world long before anyone arrived to claim they were bringing connection for the first time. The Philippines was not a blank slate waiting to be written on. It was already a page full of text. We just needed the right kind of light to read it. Radar doesn't lie, and the ground remembers everything.